Hey everyone. Back in 2015, to coincide with the release of Star Wars Episode VII, The Force Awakens, HP released a special edition Pavilion laptop. This came with a red backlit keyboard, a special Star Wars theme which included wallpapers, screensavers, Star Wars Space System 7s, and even storyboards from the original trilogy as well. And it also came with a design, or a Star Wars based design on the case. Now, I would show you the back of it, but that is currently covered in Rick and Morty stickers if you can actually see that. But yeah, the stickers don't come with it, that was me. But yeah, we don't actually care about what we're going to be looking at in the video today. Doesn't really concern anything about the laptop other than the performance. So if you join us on the dark side of the intro, we'll take a deeper dive into the specs of the special edition Star Wars laptop. Unfortunately, the Star Wars theme is as far as the differences to the standard Pavilion go. The hardware is no different. It came packing a 2.3 GHz dual-core Skylake-based i5-6200U, which can boost to 2.7 GHz on both cores, or 2.8 GHz under single-core workloads. There's 6 GB of 1600 MHz DDR3 RAM and a 4GB by 2GB configuration, but it supports up to 16 GB total. Storage came in the form of a 1TB SATA-free hard drive. However, we've taken out the DVD drive and installed a 120GB SSD instead, which is where we've installed a fresh copy of Windows 10 Pro 64-bit. The 1TB mechanical drive we're using for the games and storage, as this is technically my personal laptop as well. For graphics, we've got a GT 940M based on Nvidia's Gen 1 Maxwell architecture, using the GM108 core. This isn't particularly powerful and only comes with 2 GB of dedicated DDR3 memory, so gaming performance won't exactly be great. This technically supports DirectX 12, and from personal experience we can confirm that it will indeed run Forza Horizon 4 for example. However, it only supports DirectX 12 up to a feature level of 11, so while it may officially support it, it doesn't really, and will likely be incompatible with most DX12 based games. Overclocking is quite limited as well, as there is no support for it on the CPU at all. The 940M though does indeed support overclocking, but even that has artificial limits too. We'll bring you gaming performance both at stock and with a GPU overclock. First though, we're testing the 6200U's performance in Cinebench R20. The 6200U is a dual-core CPU, but it does support hyperthreading, which will help it out here. We run the benchmark 3 times and average out the scores to give a representation of what the CPU can reliably manage. The 6200U managed a score of 704.67 points, putting it 6.13% behind the Core 2 Quad Q8300 with a 3.308 GHz overclock, and 8.91% up on the overclocked triple-core Phenom 2 X3 710. The 6200U though pulls significantly less power than both of those. Next up is Blender, which we've only recently introduced to our CPU benchmarking suite. We're using the fishy cutscene specifically, which is relatively simple compared to the sort of work people would normally use Blender for, but it'll at least show you what simple animation and tile-based rendering is like. We set it to render a single frame and record the time it takes to do so. We do this 3 times and then average out the scores for the same reasons as Cinebench. We've only benchmarked the Xeon X5260 from a few videos ago, but the chart will fill up as we test more and more CPUs. The 6200U managed to render a single frame in an average of 157.41 seconds, or 2 minutes 37.41 seconds. This is 28.94% faster than the X5260, or 5.8% with the Xeon overclocked to 4.5 GHz, while pulling significantly less power. First up for the games is CSGO, and at 1080p with max settings and no anti-aliasing, it runs pretty well. There were some minor stutters at points, specifically in the first round, but they seemed to smooth out from then onwards. It maintained over 60 FPS throughout and had no other issues. The benchmark though suggests noticeable dips in performance, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 28 and 12.4 FPS respectively. However, you'd struggle to notice these in actual gameplay. As mentioned, overclocking the CPU is unsupported, and overclocking on the GPU is limited too. The maximum allowed GPU overclock is 135 MHz on the core. This is the highest that the sliders in MSI Afterburner allow. The DDR3 memory, on the other hand, can go much further, another 250 MHz over stock clocks before it becomes unstable. With the overclock came a small improvement in performance, with figures of 81.6, 32.3 and 13.8 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% lows, according to CapFrameX, which we used to obtain our benchmark figures. There weren't many issues to improve upon from stock, and there was still a minor stutter on one occasion. However, performance like stock was plenty good enough already. And yes, it runs Crysis. 1080p with the lowest settings was used, and we've also had to use DirectX 9, as for some reason Windows 10 forces the game into 50Hz mode when using DirectX 10. That aside, the game ran quite smoothly throughout, however there were some brief but noticeable stutters at times. This was especially apparent in the latter few minutes of the test, in which there were regular frame time spikes around 86 milliseconds mark. This is something we found to be quite common in a lot of the hardware we've benchmarked on the channel. There were also issues with texture and object pop-in too. Again, another common issue we found on the channel. Other than that, the game ran great and maintained at least 50 FPS throughout. It managed 56.8, 30.4 and 10.5 FPS, average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. The stuttering we saw at points and near the end of the test account for the low 0.1% low frame rate. Gameplay isn't affected though. The overclock was interesting in that parts, such as the latter few minutes of the test, it improved performance a bit. The severity of the regular spikes near the end were reduced by around 10 milliseconds or so, whereas in other parts, there were actually more frame time spikes than previously. FPS stayed above 60 throughout, with brief hitches at times as well. The object and texture pop-in was still present too. It managed 70.6, 33.7 and 12.7 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. Improvements of 24.3, 10.86 and 20.95% respectively. Next up is Doom. Not Doom Eternal, but Doom 2016. This was the worst performer of the tests, and even at 720p with the lowest settings, 16x anisotropic filtering and Vulkan enabled, performance wasn't great. FPS dipped to the low 20s at points, and over the test duration, the frame times were really inconsistent, represented by micro-stuttering throughout. Input lag is also an issue as well, making the game more difficult to play than it should be. It is however playable though, if you can put up with the issues. Stock managed 35.8, 18.8 and 13.2 FPS, average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. The GPU overclock improved things a lot, but couldn't eliminate the issues we saw. Micro stutter was still present throughout, and ideally you would need to drop the resolution further for smoother gameplay. The overclock managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 47, 25.1 and 16.9 FPS respectively. Improvements of 31.28, 33.51 and 28.03% respectively, showing just how much 940M is holding back performance here. Last up is GTA 5, which we're having to run at 1600 by 900, as 1080p, despite running to a playable level, had an issue where the vehicle seemed unusually heavy for some reason. It's not something that ruins it, but it is an uncomfortable feeling when you know what the vehicle handling is actually supposed to be like. That aside, the lowest settings with 16x anisotropic filtering are being used, with population density, population variety, and distance scaling all at 50%. We started off as normal by taking a drive through the city towards Michael's house. FPS could dip to the low 30s and hit the low 40s throughout the city. Overall, the game actually ran really well throughout, apart from one minor stutter, but other than that, there were no issues at all. Also, the vehicles don't actually feel heavy like they did at 1080p, which also actually ran alright, with FPS over 30 for the most part, with occasional dips under 30 in the city. 1600 by 900 achieved 43.2, 29.7 and 20.7 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, with 1080 managing 35.6, 24.6 and 16.9 FPS average, 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. There were frame time spikes throughout for both, but frame times were generally quite consistent. The overclock improved things a fair bit at 1080p, and less so at 1600 by 900 due to how well it already performed at stock. 1080p now performs better than 1600 by 900 at stock clocks, at least in the benchmark, as there was still an issue with the vehicles feeling heavier than they should. There weren't really any issues that needed improvement at stock for 1600 by 900, so the improvement here isn't really noticeable, if at all. It did though manage 50.3, 33.1 and 24.3 FPS for average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. Improvements of 16.44, 11.45 and 17.39% respectively. The performance of the Special Edition Star Wars laptop, it's actually quite surprising, to be honest. Now, admittedly, I already had personal experience of what the performance was like because, as I mentioned previously, it is my personal laptop, so I've tried to play games on it over the years since I bought it. But yeah, speaking about the benchmarks specifically, it's actually going to be quite handy for playing sort of any kind of game from around the era Grand Theft Auto V was released and before. If you're talking about more modern games such as Doom, or nowadays even Doom Eternal, which we also did test on this, then even at lower resolutions such as 720p, you're really not going to have much luck. But if, like I said, if you're talking about Grand Theft Auto V and sort of games from around that time and before, then a slight reduction in resolution and lower settings, if you can put up with that, are pretty much the only thing you'll have to do to actually get to play those kind of games. It is actually surprising that you can play so many different kinds of games on this laptop, and I was actually really surprised personally when I bought it that I was able to play all of these games. So yeah, overall we're actually really surprised with how well the Special Edition Star Wars laptop did. And before we finish up today, I'd like to give shout-outs to Patreon supporters TazFaeDodge, ShadowInTheVoid and Peter for helping to make all of this possible. So everyone, if you enjoyed the video, leave a comment and a like, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more content like this, and don't forget to share the video as well. And you can also support us in creating these videos through our Patreon at patreon.com/BenchyTests, or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/BenchyTests. And remember, Ko-fi has a hyphen between the KO and FI. But if you do decide to become a patron, you'll gain early access to all of our videos before the public do, for as long as you remain a patron. So thanks again for watching, hopefully we'll see you next time.